Hello, and welcome. I am so excited to chat through today's topic because it's a controversial one, it's a scary one, and it has to be talked about. So, today we're actually going to be talking about using synthetic users, so using a synthetic audience and a synthetic panel. I'm going to walk you through how I've used this using Qualtrics synthetic panel. And I'm going to talk through the project setup, how I feel about it, the analysis, and how you can kind of go about interpreting that analysis. So, we're going to go through quite a bit today. And I just want to say, before I dive into the whole process, that I know synthetic users slash panels slash audiences, pretty much anything synthetic is quite scary as a user researcher myself. So I know I don't work full time in house as a researcher anymore, but I am still a user research consultant and I work as a consultant. And so I need my job to stick around as a user researcher, as I know all of us want our jobs as user researchers to stick around and we don't feel like it should be replaced by anything. So when synthetic first came out, I was hugely skeptical and didn't really even give it the time of day. I just bashed it without really understanding the different types of synthetic panels, synthetic audiences, and stuff like that. And so today, what I want to accomplish is walking through how we might be able to utilize synthetic as a tool in our toolkit, not as a replacement. Because, as I said, I want my job to stick around. So I don't see synthetic as a replacement of user research or as a replacement of talking to humans. The way that I want to use synthetic in the future is very, very specific circumstances where it feels like it might be applicable. And I will walk through those circumstances and situations throughout this video so that we can kind of understand, okay, where might synthetic perform the best and where might it not perform as well, so that we can get really clear. And I will say that, as a user researcher, I've always been concerned and skeptical about things that I feel like could replace me. So it comes from a lot of fear of being replaced, fear of not being impactful, fear of people like missing out on the value that I can bring as a human and doing human based research. And I was skeptical of things like unmoderated usability testing. I hated surveys for the longest time because I am, or not as much anymore, but I was a diehard quali. I hated jobs to be done, right? And these are all things that over time, what I did was understand, okay, I as a individual cannot continue to push reality away. I need to understand the reality that we are in and utilize it to the best of my ability so that I can also educate other people, so stakeholders, clients, in how to best use these different kinds of tools. So just as a disclaimer before we dive in, what I'm going to be doing is walking you through a study that I put together with Qualtrics using their synthetic panel, and again, talking through my experience as we go. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. So this is Qualtrics. We are at the home page. This is as home as you can get. Qualtrics is a pretty fairly popular tool, but if you've never heard of them, I recommend checking them out. They have, in addition to synthetic, they have a lot of other human-based panels as well, and a lot of capabilities. I actually use Qualtrics a lot as a user researcher when I was beginning in the field, and then have used it kind of throughout my career. So definitely give Qualtrics a look-see if you are not familiar with the tool. But what we are going to do today, again, is use Qualtrics to walk through an experience of using a synthetic panel. So I have a few different documents here, and you'll see it's a user research plan and then a guide that I actually created for you to use when and if you decide to engage with a synthetic audience or a synthetic panel just to try it out. And I do recommend, like, you don't have to run an actual study. You don't have to run is something that is high risk, nor should you through this, but just trying out the synthetic panel from my perspective as a user researcher, like trying out these tools so that we at least have an experience of what they are and can speak about and to them, I think is really, really important. We'll go through that guide as we go through this whole experience. But first, I just wanted to talk you through like the user research plan that I put together for this particular study. So I decided to look into how people think about starting a new routine. So, including what motivates or discourages them using synthetic research. So it's really exploring early themes. And we're going to talk more about, the performance of synthetic in terms of when to use it and maybe when to shy away from it. So as you'll see here, I have a normal research plan. There are a few things that I did not include, such as target audience, so recruitment criteria and timeline, because synthetic is pretty much instantaneous. So timeline wise, it's a little bit less important. But if you see here, this is the research statement and goals that we are going to be going through, which is essentially looking into starting a new routine, like the mental models behind that, using synthetic research. And that's like discovering current mindset, decision making, emotional barriers or friction points, resources or support systems, and understanding like a bit of a mental model of what starting a routine means. So if you'll see here, I went and I created these study questions. So we're going to kind of go back and forth between this. This is, if we go in here, we create this new study. And this is what this essentially looks like. And it will look like to you, like it did to me, probably a survey, because it is a survey. We are surveying a synthetic panel. So all of these questions here are they look like just normal survey questions. There are a few changes that I will highlight as we kind of go through, but they are survey-based questions. So we're just going to pop into this guide really quickly. As I said, you're going to have access to this. So if you want to follow along or go more in depth, feel free to utilize this. But I just want to get into really quickly how Qualtrics Edge works and a little bit about the difference that you might see between something like ChatGPT and Qualtrics Edge. So Qualtrics Edge actually has three components, which is the base LLM. So like ChatGPT, Perplexity, it has aggregated survey data. So essentially millions of rows of survey responses and data collected by Qualtrics over the past 25 years, and then additional training data that adds breadth and depth to the training set. So why is this important? So whenever we ask ChatGPT or Claude to pretend to be a user, it's lacking because it's trained on public internet data. It's not like trained on actual research-based data. So you tend to get agreeable, positive, or just complete garbage from something like this. It's not really designed for like the structured survey responses. It doesn't really have realistic demographic variation, whereas the reason that this feels different, Qualtrics can feel different, is that it is actually built based on data responses and survey responses from real humans, not just like the random public internet data that gets thrown out there. If you're interested in going into this a little bit more, you can kind of see in terms of the audiences, where Qualtrics performs versus humans, versus GPT and something like Gemini. So essentially, it's closer to human responses than any of the other LLMs. So this is why, for at least from my perspective, I just want to understand this better so that I can talk about it, talk to the experience, and really understand where this might come out based on, or where this might come out with regards to the differences between this and human responses. So it is trained on actual human responses and fed this information to be as close to human as possible. So for me, like, I just want to understand what all of this means and like process it and then kind of experiment with this. And that's what I really, really recommend doing, is experimenting with this type of tool to understand where it really shines and where it might not be as helpful. So we're going to go through a use case decision tree in a second where I talk through like what I found synthetic to perform well on versus not as well. But first, what I want to do is talk through some performance characteristics, because with a survey, if we look at just like this, we have different question types here, lots of different question types. And so how do we utilize synthetic in the best way possible? So Qualtrics, this particular model performs best with things like frequency scales, single select questions, numeric responses, satisfaction scales, and agreement scales. There is moderate performance with single select or yes no questions or something like the NPS, and there's weaker performance with likelihood and importance scales. So within this, you're not really asking a synthetic panel open-ended questions. And at least from like my standpoint, which was what was quite nice about that, is I was like, oh, like we're actually not doing replaceable research here. Like we're just gaining an understanding of things before we talk to humans. We're not like replacing anything because we're not asking synthetic like open-ended questions. We are, and you'll see like with my research plan and my research study that I ran, it's like single select. You can include like matrix agreement scales in there too, right? But it's single select. And what I love about that is like that's so for me like delineated like, okay, this is a tool for this particular situation. It is not a replacement because we're not asking it to do anything that would like replace qualitative research, right? We're also not asking it to replace surveys either, like human-based surveys. So I really liked that, where I was like, cool, I'm not even asking open-ended questions. So it's like a completely different tool to that qualitative deep based research. One thing that I will say, which is the weirdest thing for me as a researcher, because I don't usually talk about future tense ever, right? So if you know me, I'm always like ask people about their past behaviors, ask them to recall past experiences, stories, memories, like that all should be like past based, or even a survey question should be past based. Like, how often did you order takeaway in the past 3 weeks? Really past based. And, stakeholders always come to us with the woulds. Would people do this? Would people do that? Would. So, actually, what was difficult for me at first, but really interesting, is that future tense is actually the strongest. So, which would you most likely choose? Because what this is it is a model. The model essentially in the data is like aggregating the statistical probability of what this group of people would say, right? So we can't think of it as like this is what this group of people said because we didn't ask people, but the model is essentially predicting what this group of people would respond to in this particular scenario. So future tense is actually the strongest use case here. Present tense is a moderate use case here. So which do you prefer? What comes to mind? Which feels more relevant? Past tense is actually the weakest here. So it doesn't perform as well as future or present tense, because a lot of times what's happening with past tense questions is we're asking about somebody's lived experience. And because we are asking a synthetic audience, which is again the prediction of what people would say, the synthetic audience obviously doesn't have the really nuanced lived experience. So future based or present tense questions, that's where we're going to kind of sit with this particular study. So the last thing before we dive in that I want to go over is the use case decision tree. So when is synthetic the most useful in terms of when we could experiment with it, when we could try it, when we could really utilize it? So the first one is running your survey questions through synthetic before you field them to real people. We don't do this enough as user researchers, I believe, and I am so guilty of this, where I have sent out a survey that I shouldn't have sent out, or that I should have piloted, or maybe I sent to a few people who were like, yeah, it looks good, but didn't actually look over it. So essentially, running your survey through synthetic before you field it to real people is really awesome. The only caveat here is obviously synthetic is better with that future based tense. So what I would recommend doing is it's okay to use the future base for the synthetic audience, but change it to past when you're giving it to or when you're sending it out to humans, which is fine. But really, we're like catching obvious problems. We're looking at logic flow. And it's just a really nice way to make sure that we're not asking like too many questions, and we're going to get into the interpretation in a little bit. But for instance, I had a question about good enough decisions. And when I ran it through synthetic, I got a flat distribution, which means that like every option was equally chosen by the synthetic panel, which told me that my options were like too overlapping. So this is just a really great way to like brush up on those survey skills and really make sure that you're testing that survey before giving it to real participants. So testing numerous concepts quickly in a low risk environment. This always happens where like you get handed 10 different onboarding flow concepts. You need to get to 3, let's say, before doing usability testing, because it's not ideal to test 10 concepts with real people. So synthetic can maybe help you eliminate the 5 that are confusing or more contradictory, and you can advance the strongest 3 to evaluating with humans, right? And this saves a lot of time because, again, ideally, you're not really testing 10 different flow concepts with participants. So, very low risk environment. You're not saying yay or nay to one concept. You're just kind of narrowing the scope of your test. Understanding features that seem most valuable before you invest in full evaluation of the features. So this tends to happen where, let's say, someone on the product team, like a VP of product or the CEO or somebody like that comes to you and is like, oh, I had this idea, for this feature. And you're like, is this even viable for us to look into? What you can do is look through the lens of synthetic in terms of, what might be the value propositions of these particular features. Do they land? Do they not land within the synthetic audience, which then needs to be evaluated afterwards. But what I will say is imagine you're testing a bunch of different feature descriptions for a tool, and synthetic shows that 3 descriptions are too abstract and people would be unable to parse what is actually offered. So then that helps give the team direction on which ones to actually prototype and evaluate and bring to a human-based research. So essentially, a lot of this is like, as researchers, we tend to be given too much. And it's like, again, narrowing the scope so that when we do get to humans, it is the most valuable research that we can be doing. After human research, this was quite interesting. So a lot of what I've talked about is before human research. After human research is also quite interesting. So let's say your interviews surface something unexpected and you want to see if there is like a broader reaction to that. And so what we would do is we would go back into synthetic after the human research and kind of understand, hey, these kind of one-off or off-topic insights came out. I wonder if it's worth kind of going and doing a separate study for something like this. So in a study that I ran on food choices, the synthetic panel showed a cost versus speed tension. And so what I ended up doing is I tested that hypothesis of speed and cost when it comes to choosing food. And I found that there was like a pretty intense tension there. So I went back and we reimagined the study to be, okay, there's all this other stuff when it comes to food and food choices, but there's like this really interesting mix of a cost versus speed, and that could be its own study entirely. Right. So again, narrowing the scope and then testing competitive offerings with your customer profile safely and privately. So look at switching behaviors, testing your positioning, comparing to competitors, right? And then again, evaluating this afterwards with humans. So we're not necessarily taking this information and saying, this is it, this is how people respond, but it's more like this is how it's predicted that people will respond. And now can we go in, make some changes and evaluate that with people? Here is a bit of a decision framework where it goes through these questions that you should ask yourself to decide, questions that you should ask yourself before using synthetic, and it will help you with kind of understanding what is best. So again, I go through all of these wonderful examples for you to go ahead and utilize and walk through. So let's actually set up the test. And as normal, we would want to, it's like, this is actually very similar and needs the same rigor as any other research method. You wouldn't send out a sloppy survey. So it's that same rigor that we need to apply here. First things first is defining your research objective. I actually really like this. So use synthetic to do a specific action so that I can have a specific outcome. And this is great before the human research step, right? So always have that human research step in there, like as a reminder. So narrowing 10 message directions, testing survey logic, screening 8 feature concepts so I can identify the 3 worth prototyping. Again, examples that don't work, understand why users abandon checkout, learn about customer pain points in a journey, right? Those are not ideal. So filling this out is really helpful. And again, setting your boundaries is really great here. So documenting what synthetic will not be used for. And I give some examples here because again, it's about using synthetic for a directional signal and then evaluating with humans. So it should always be crossed over. And then we go into designing our audience. The same logic for recruitment applies here as to like any sort of study. So we wouldn't recruit left-handed surgeons from Omaha who switched CRMs in the last 6 months unless we had unlimited time and budget to find those people. But we can obviously like utilize audiences. Right now, Qualtrics has the US general population, but I'm pretty sure right now Qualtrics has the US general population, but they are expanding. So here, for instance, moms, millennials, pet owners, households of 3 plus, people earning this amount of money, professionals in certain roles, right? That's totally fine. Too narrow are like this multiple stacked scenarios that we have here, very recent specific behaviors or hyper niche combinations. If you'd have trouble recruiting people in general with any sort of study, then it's probably too narrow for synthetic. Same kind of thing. So now we are going into structure our questions, and I want to walk you through the questions that I used for this particular study. So if you see here, we have 10. Yeah, 10 questions that I came up with. The first one is a little like screener question, and it's just for context to understand, okay, we are talking about starting a new routine and the goals and the choices behind those. So it's almost like just like a setting question and like a context question. This is future based. So if you were starting a new routine this month, what kind of goal would you most likely focus on? And it's single choice. And we have these different options, improve. And what's also really nice about utilizing this, especially before a survey, is, you can put like a lot more options in a synthetic survey than you ideally would in a human-based survey, and you can test those options. So some of them might be completely irrelevant, which you could kind of like scope out of the survey. Right. And so we have these particular, human-based answers: physical health, money, productivity, learning a new skill, sleep, rest, connecting. I wouldn't set any. Right. And then what I did is I went into different areas like framing and intent, motivation and friction, support and tools, meaning and identity. And so these are just like different areas that you can scope with synthetic audiences. So we have the framing and intent. So again, imagine. So this is very like future based, the start of a new month, and you're thinking about starting a new routine. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Right. And so if we look, kind of jump back here, we have 3 different elements that are super ideal for survey questions when it comes to synthetic. I mean, again, it's pretty similar to survey-based logic. We want a scenario frame. So imagine you are, or would you be doing this? This is present, near, future. And then a single cognitive task. Like we don't want double-barreled questions. We don't want, super open-ended information. Same with surveys, and then direct answer options, right? So not personal lived experience and distinct options. So it's very similar. Again, it's very similar to a real survey that is going out to humans. It's just this like more like future slash near present framing that we use that is less like human based surveys. So here we have all of the questions. So again, imagine it's right after New Year's Day. You're considering a routine reset. What's most likely to influence what you choose to focus on? We have motivation and friction. Which of these best describes your mindset when starting them? What would most likely stop you? Again, future, future, future. And we have support and tools. So, which of these support types would help the most? This is like a very happy stakeholder here because it's like the kinds of questions that stakeholders ask a lot. Again, we are not using this as human data. We're using this as a prediction of what types of people, what types of support people might want based on all of the data that the synthetic panel has. And then meaning and identity, which is a little bit more interesting here. Which of these statements best reflects starting routine and what that means to them? Which of these feels more true? What do you wish you believed about yourself? These are all very interesting, and we'll get to those in a second. So really quickly, there are 5 most common question types that I would like to share, which is friction barriers, prioritization, value proposition, mindset and approach, and support preferences. Those are the best performing question types that I have found with this synthetic audience. And I give models on how to write them and examples of options that you could go ahead and utilize. So let's pop in here. Essentially, what we will be doing is putting our questions into synthetic. So you have a default question block. We can call this the screener. So we can kind of make it clear. So we have the question here. And what we would do is go ahead and put all of this information in just as we would for a normal survey. And I promise I'm not gonna make you sit through me doing 10 of these because that is not enjoyable for anybody to watch. But I just want to walk through like this to showcase. And then if we want to add a new one, we just press enter. Okay. And this. Cool. So this is our question. This is screener 1 here, and this is our little screener. So you can see here block behavior, there's question randomization. So randomize the order of questions. That's really, really helpful. You can see that there is question logic here. So allowing one answers versus multiple answers, right? So single select versus multi-select, the number of choices that you have, the format, which is the list, or you could do a drop down, you could do a select box, the alignment, which would be weird as horizontal. There's a column. Ah, interesting. Vertical, you can tell that I don't do very many columned surveys. And then we have requirements, right? So we can add requirements. So this is forcing a response. You can also request a response, but we'll force the response. And validation. So validation will pass if the following condition is met. If you were likely to focus on this, getting better with money is selected or not, or displayed or not. We have like kind of like an error message or something to like showcase like something is not met, a condition is not met. So that is super helpful. Then we have display logic, skip logic, carry forward choices, choice randomization, which is great. So display answers in a random order. I'm always a huge fan of that. And then any sort of like display logic. So displaying this question only if the following condition is met, right? So if that were met, then we would, and something they responded in a certain way, we would go maybe to a different potential question. Again, skip logic here as well. Really great. So there's a lot that you can do here, not necessarily necessary for synthetic, but we'd add another block here and we'd say, here we go. We have our second block. And I do this just to make it like nice to like, have this kind of understanding of like, okay, these are the framing and intent questions. These are the motivation questions. And again, what I would do is just go back here, add my multiple choice question, and this would be Q1, right? And then fill in our choices. So I'm going to pause for a moment and come back when all of these are filled in, and we will go through what that actually looks like. Okay, so this is our survey right here. So as you can see, again, we have these different blocks and we have forced a response. We've allowed only one answer. So quite straightforward here. You can also import your questions. So if you had a library of questions, which is really great, you could import that here. You can preview what this looks like, as we always like to do. I guess it depends on how much you care about robot people in terms of like making this look nice. But it's really great to be able to preview this even with a synthetic, because it gives you, again, like a chance to make sure that this will look good when it comes to sending it to the humans. So essentially what we would do next is go ahead and publish, and I would call it synthetic version so we can understand that. And we're going to go and publish and activate it. Okay, great. Distributions. So this is where we choose our online panel. So if you see here, we have the distributions looking for respondents. Yes, we're going to create a panel. And you'll see that, again, as I mentioned, Qualtrics has quite a few panels. So we have general pop for the US, we have UK general pop, France general pop, lots of general pops. We also have like pet owners, political party, so grocery shopping. But we are going to go with the general population for synthetic. So we have, yep, our synthetic number of responses. I mean, I would say, we have a recommended 300 to 400 responses for each cut of data you plan to analyze. I go with 500 responses here, but you could definitely bring it down to 300. And if you see here the cost here, you could even bring it down to probably 200, where this is, yeah, really, really great cost. If you think about like testing this and getting directional signal, that's pretty fantastic. So country or region, they, as of right now, they only have US general pop, but I know that they are expanding that. And then the incidence rates, so the percentage of responses who start and finish your survey. So this is how often your target respondents occur within a population. Don't worry about this, especially for synthetic. Just keep it at their recommended rate. So as we have here, we have 50-50 pretty much split of male and female. We have a pretty much evenly distributed split of age. We could play around with this. We could put 1% here. Let's say we don't want these age ranges and we're more focused on, let's say, the 35s to 44s. So we need 29 plus 17. This is where you find out that I am absolutely horrendous at math. That took me a really long time. To be fair, I did it while I was talking. So we get like a heavy distribution towards that age if we want to. We have different origins. So we have Hispanic and non-Hispanic. We have different ethnicities here if you want to play around with those numbers. And then we have different regions as well within the US. So again, these are synthetics. So this is the essentially utilizing the demographics here are what the model would predict these demographics within the human population to say, right? So it is that prediction model of like, okay, for 35 to 44-year-olds, we're predicting their response to be like this. So next we go through and we do a confirmation here, and then next, and then again, agreeing to the T's and C's, and then we pay and launch. So what I will do is I'm going to go ahead and launch this. So I actually already ran this survey in the background. So we are going to go now and look at the results and see how to interpret those. Welcome back. So, as I said, I had run the study on starting a new routine already and collected the results. But what I recall is the 500 responses came in a few hours. So within a few hours, I had this directional information that could help us with understanding the preliminary information that we are seeing. So if you see, this is a little bit different in terms of what we were seeing before. So we had seen the survey before, and now we're looking at the actual data. So here are the responses essentially, and all of the data that the synthetic panel provided with us. So the date, the question, and looking through individual responses here. So if we just go to this, we view the response. This is what the synthetic audience for this particular respondent came back with. So here it has the choices that the synthetic model made and the information. So the age, ethnicity, and that kind of information here. But more importantly than that, if we head on over to the results page, what you will see is something that looks exactly like a survey information. Again, what we are looking at is survey data rather than from human respondents. This is the prediction of what these human groups would say if we were to run this with human based data over and over again, right? So this is like the predicted output for human based information. So this is predicting how humans would respond to these questions. And if you see here, there is a chart. There's also this information which showcases the percentages and the count. So really the weight as well. And it goes through all of this for each of the questions that we asked. And you can see all of that too. And then you can see as well information on gender and age. So like these distributions. And as we did so in the other one, I showed a higher distribution from 35 to 44-year-olds, I think it was. On this one, we had the distribution that Qualtrics had recommended. So a more spread distribution, as you can see here, the for synthetic 99-year-olds making some habits. So looking at all of this, again, it looks very much like a normal human-based survey. And we want to apply that same rigor to interpreting these synthetic results as we do for surveys. We're not going to have raw transcripts. We're not going to have quotes. We're not going to be rewatching videos. We're not going to be analyzing open-ended script. But this is giving us the percentages, the patterns, and the predictions from the model, right? So again, it's predictions of what humans would say if we reran the study. So I look at like 3 different areas, and then I'm going to go into a model and we're going to walk through some examples. But I look for signal strength, so where the responses cluster or diverge. I look for confidence, how solid these predictions are across synthetic replicates. So if you were to replicate the study, or if you were to compare the synthetic study to a human study, so that's something else that is really interesting to experiment with, is running a synthetic survey and running the same human-based survey. Of course, making sure the tenses are a little bit aligned for your tool. And then inconsistencies or surprises where the model outputs don't match your actual intuition. So just like with any other like new tool or new methodology, I like to apply models as much as possible. So when it comes to synthesizing and interpreting synthetic data, I created something called the RISE model, which for each of those letters, RISE, they stand for a different way to kind of look at the data to make sure that we're looking in it in the most holistic way and make sure that we are in the best way possible questioning it just like we would with normal data, right? So with qualitative user research, you would sit back and you would question the data and you would look through it and you would, ask yourself different questions about it. Same with any sort of quantitative data. And this is like no different. I just used a slightly different model than I might do for other research. Like we can't really affinity diagram here because there's no actual like quotes or open ends. And because it is synthetic data, I didn't want to apply like the exact one-to-one that I might do with a survey, but you will see that it is very similar to how I might interpret and synthesize a survey. So just like with any other new tool, new methodology, this is a new kind of synthesis for me. So what I did is quite a bit of trial and error on how to best synthesize this information. And I created something called the RISE model, where each letter RISE stands for a different way to kind of look at the data. And I will say that this is similar to how we might look at qualitative data, quantitative data, right? We look at it, we massage it, we question it, we prompt ourselves. It's the same kind of idea because just like with qual data, we want to make sure that we are getting the most important information out of it. Same with quantitative data. We want to make sure that we're getting and interpreting the results as correctly as we can. It applies to synthetic data as well. So we're not like affinity diagramming because we don't have qualitative data to affinity diagram. And I didn't want to take this data and apply like exactly one to one how I analyze and synthesize surveys. I wanted something slightly different because this is so new and I wanted to force myself to look at the data in as many ways as possible. So if you are struggling with or concerned about or not really sure how to approach interpreting synthetic data, I'm hoping that this model will give you some guidance and clarity around that. So I'm going to go between this document and the study that we have up to talk through the different areas of the RISE model and how to use it. So the first one is response integrity, and this is whether the results you're seeing make sense or point to a pattern that you didn't expect. So again, we're looking at a model that is predicting what this audience will say. That means that we're not really looking for individual answers because we don't really have like open-ended data. We want to look at the overall like logic and response pattern essentially. So to me, like when I first looked at this, I was like, okay, like I want to know how well these responses track with like what I know about the audience, any sort of like intuition that comes out of it. Does something feel really off based on the responses that I get? And like, again, really, really looking at the data and asking yourself these prompting questions. The reason that for me, like response integrity was the first step here and something that I really wanted to explore is because, we are dealing with a different data set than we're used to, right? We're dealing with the synthetic data set. So what's great about this is that if you have an understanding already of your audience, of your customers, like a baseline understanding, this can help you kind of understand how does synthetic feel when it responds to these questions, as opposed to what you might assume an audience would respond like. So, for example, when I ran my study, one of the questions was if you were starting a new routine this month, what kind of goal would you most likely focus on? We have improving physical health, we have getting better with money, building a new productivity habit, learning a new skill, improving sleep or rest, connecting with others, or protecting family time. And I wouldn't set any routine. So, looking at this through the R lens, so the response integrity, the top response was improving physical health, which makes sense. So whenever we talk about starting new routines, start of the month, start of the year, this happens to be a goal for a lot of people. And health is usually like something that comes up quite often when it comes to creating goals and focusing on particular goals. The other ones, productivity habits and improving sleep or rest, those also make sense because they're tied to managing energy, time, fatigue. So we have like physical and mental energy regulation. I was a little bit like, I was like getting better with money to me, like felt like it should score higher. Right. So I was like a little bit like, oh, well, like I don't know, like that to me felt a little bit off. But when put against the different options of improving physical health, productivity, or sleep and rest, maybe it does rank lower. So that would be something that I would really want to look into. As I said here, like anything unusually low, learning a new skill felt low, but that kind of makes sense because it's like secondary. I feel like, connecting with others under 10%, which makes sense. Again, the getting better with money kind of like I was like, oh, like I don't know. And maybe what I would do here is like kind of take a look at, the more like kind of if there was any demographic information that highlighted the age and gender of the respondents, the synthetic age and gender of these respondents with getting better with money to see if there was something there. So that would be quite interesting. So what does this actually tell us? Again, this question has some clear front runners, which means the audience isn't confused or scattered. To me, it comes off as something that makes sense. So again, like going in and fact checking those responses and questions is really important. And I just go through some different like statements you can use if you're getting stuck here. So the next one is internal consistency across questions. So does your synthetic audience make sense across the survey? So does it form like a coherent picture? I like to say if they say they're terrified of flying in scene 1 but happily jump out of a plane in scene 5, that's confusing with absolutely no explanation. Same here. You're looking for like contradictions here. So you can ask yourself some questions to help you get to that conclusion of whether this feels like cohesive or whether it feels like in, one question they're answering in a certain way and in another question it's like really contradictory. So from my study, I asked, imagine it's the start of a new month and you're thinking about starting a new routine. What's the first thing that usually comes to mind? The goal I want to achieve. So let's link that to another question. And like what you want to do, obviously, with this one, when you're looking for internal consistency, is link these questions together to understand, like, okay, is there consistency or contradiction? So which of these would most likely stop you from continuing a new routine after a few days or weeks, and then feeling too tired or busy, not seeing results fast enough, pressure from other priorities? So this felt like a nice consistency check here. So nearly half the audience, or the synthetic shows us that nearly half the audience might start from that goal first mindset. And the top reasons they give for not following through are like external limits, which to me, again, if we go back to looking at response integrity and then consistency, that makes sense. It's kind of like we're starting with like, we want to do well, not we don't think we're going to do well already and then we're failing because of a lack of motivation, let's say. So we're trying our best and we have external forces coming at us. So that to me tracks pretty nicely. Right. And so when you write in your synthesis, you might say, across the data set, the synthetic audience consistently prioritizes goal setting when initiating new routines, but later cites time, energy, and external demands as the biggest barriers to follow through. This suggests a goal-oriented mindset constrained by situational burnout, not lack of intent. So that's something that you could say there. We could also match questions 3 and 6. So which of these best describes your mindset when starting a new routine? And then which formats would make it easiest to stick to a new routine? So we're having like, I feel hopeful and ready, but like, again, I want to do it, but I expect to fail. Like these are all kind of close to each other. I'm excited, but I get distracted. A simple checklist that makes sense. Like if we're wanting to do it, but we're expecting to fail. If we're excited, but getting distracted easily, a simple checklist to follow for what format would make it easiest to stick to a routine, that makes sense. When we walk into this goal with hope, but we almost expect to fail or expect to get distracted, it makes sense to want something simple. So a simple checklist. And how you could say this in analysis is 30% of the synthetic audience describe themselves as hopeful and ready, and equal share expected to fail or get distracted. This split maps closely to the predictive preference for a simple checklist format, which could serve as a confidence builder and for friction reducer for an audience expecting setbacks. So these are guiding pairs for spotting internal consistency, right? So if we look at priorities and trade-offs, stated barriers and preferred solutions, what they avoid and what they choose, right? Those are really just great ways to kind of look through the data if you are having some issues with how to look through the internal consistencies here. The next one is spread of responses. So how tightly grouped or wildly scattered your synthetic outputs are tells you how unified that audience really is. So again, spread tells you, what is kind of going on in terms of, okay, like how is it predicting the audience will respond to this particular question? Do you have shared beliefs? Do you have alignment? Do you have completely opposite ends of what you might expect? there are different spread patterns that you can look through, and we'll go into more detail of the different spread patterns as well. So this is what's really great about the spread of responses, is that it forces us to sit down and like look at the data as a whole, rather than just saying, oh, you know what, the synthetic data said that when people are thinking about starting a new routine, the first thing that comes to mind is the goal that they want to achieve. Done, boom. Right. So we want to really look at this a little bit more holistically and understand, okay, where is the spread and what does that mean? So let's go through 4 different scenarios from my study. The first being like a tight consensus. So this is like the responses are mostly for 1 or 2 areas. So which of these formats make it easiest for you to stick to a routine? Again, the simple checklist at 47% and everything else being below. So what this could be telling you is there's like a dominant intuitive preference. The model is predicting that that audience might have that preference, and it could signal a baseline motivator in the decision-making process, right? So what does simple mean? What does a simple checklist actually mean for people? And this is where it's fantastic to be able to like dig into then human-based data after you're doing something like this. So we could say, nearly half the synthetic audience chose checklists over like audio guides or nudges or trackers. So simplicity could win. And that's something that we should test with users, right? So if you have a whole multitude of concepts coming through in terms of like ways to help people, like you could judge, okay, like from 1 to 5 for each of these concepts, what is the simplicity level? And does it really like align with what we're thinking we might find when it comes to this human-based data? The other is split priority, when 2 or 3 answers compete for attention. So what would you tell a friend who wants to start a new routine, even if you don't follow that advice yourself? I loved this question. Start small and build slowly. Track your progress every day. Don't overthink it, just start. So there's no like one driver here, and there might be distinct behavioral types at play. So like you might see in here, what this might indicate to you is that the synthetic data is telling you you might have different like audiences in here. So you might have, some people who are more like budget driven, some people who are more like emotional driven, some people who are more process driven, some people who want to get things done faster, like just go for it. So this could very well indicate that, this that mindset or segmentation could be really interesting to look into when it comes to that human-based data. So I think that that is actually, at least for me, when I think about how hard it can be to recruit for more generative based studies, this could give an indication where you're like, okay, like maybe I need to think about like how I'm really going to recruit. And this could be super helpful with creating some interesting recruitment based questions and screener questions, so that you're not going in and just trying to talk to everybody and then finding out these segments later on. And it just gives you a little bit more of that narrowing down of the scope. So again, that things are more efficient when it comes to the human-based research. We have a spread across the middle. So things are like loosely distributed with no strong consensus, but not like absolutely wild. So when starting a new routine, which of these support types would help you the most? It's kind of all spread out here. So there might be multiple solutions. It might have to do with people's mindset. It might have to do with, this is another shout for segmentation. Like different people might need different types of support, right? So this is also a really nice way to think about, okay, like we got like a pretty spread distribution on this. It might be beneficial for us to, if we're like looking at concepts, either like test quite a few of these and then make sure that we're like finding ways to like segment the audience to test these in. Because as I was saying up here, you might have somebody who's more process driven, you might have somebody who's more speed driven. It's the same here. Like you might have people who are more process driven, so they need something step by step. You might have people who like absolutely cannot deal with structured process, right? So this would be a really interesting way to think through for like a concept evaluation, how you might segment your audience, and how that segmentation means that like how that might affect how humans will respond to these things. And so what's really great about this is that you don't necessarily need to like segment by this information, but you can ask like one or two additional screener questions. So let's say like you're screening for a concept test where you're like trying to understand these kinds of support types and test those concepts with users. What you can do is in the recruitment and the screener survey, you can ask questions like a little bit about their mindset. Like, do you tend to, be more process driven or budget conscious, things like that, so that you can get that information so that when they react to the concept, you're able to like tie that back and say, okay, well, it seems like for the people who are like more process driven, this step-by-step structure is perfect for them. For people who are like absolutely hate process, like we need to give them like flexibility through like this kind of like more tailoring it as you go and just like nudging and supporting, right? So that to me is quite interesting because it just gives you like this extra layer of information to think about. And then finally, we have sharp drop offs or outliers. So when one or two answers dominate, with one answer trailing far behind or not fitting at all. So we have these two dominating. This one's kind of in there, but this like trails back quite a lot. So which of these statements best reflect what starting a new routine means to you? So long-term change, getting a sense of control or stability, trying something small to feel better. So this could mean that long-term change and control are strong drivers, and the synthetic data is predicting that this audience takes routines seriously, while emotional framing will still matters. So from here, I would say like over half of the synthetic data showed these routines as either a lasting change or a path to regaining control, which points to potentially a need for stability and identity, not just productivity, right? So again, like this is looking here at mindset and okay, like what are people feeling when they are thinking about this mental model of starting a new routine. So from my standpoint, what would be really interesting going into this is I would utilize this to write some interview questions to really dig into this like reflection on what starting a new routine means, because it's quite spread, right? And I know we have like a bit of a trailing behind here, but still it is quite interesting and spread out here. So I would want to like really dig into this to see if there are a few different mental models in here and to see if different people like respond in different ways and there's any sort of segmentation that we need to take further. If you're struggling with any spreads, like this can help. So just don't forget like to look over this guide, because again, it should be helpful to you. And finally, the last one is explanations and reasoning. So because we can't affinity diagram, we're not working with raw transcripts, we're not working with quotes and narrative data. We still have to do our best to understand underlying logic, just like you would in a survey. So this is where you put your survey hat on as much as possible. So we're really looking for patterns that reveal pain points being resolved, shortcuts, trade-offs, and mindsets dominating a decision. And we're trying to translate that story into a working hypothesis for human follow-up, which is probably, I would say this one is the hardest one for me, but that's just because I'm a qualitative researcher. So I tend to like really lean on and rely on stories. So let's take an example from my data set. So imagine it's the start of a new month. You're thinking about starting a new routine. What's the first thing that usually comes to mind? So the goal, whether I can stay consistent, and whether I failed before. So this is a potential map for me of mental models. So we're looking really into that primary focus on what goal I want to achieve. So that's like very goal driven, very focused. But we also have these, can I stay consistent and have I failed before, which then shows self-doubt. So what I would say is wonderful about this is that with this synthetic, we can kind of see like, oh, these are like quite, at least the goal I want to achieve. And then these two more negative ones are quite again tense in a way, like they show quite a lot of tension. So I would be curious then to test with humans, okay, like, is the goal I want to achieve really that primary thing that comes up? And does the self doubt like creep in later? Right? Like, what's the journey of that mental model essentially? So, like, is it inherent? Is it something that comes up? When does it come up? So, this is where it gets kind of fun for me in like building a research plan and interview questions for humans, because I'm like, wow, like, now I want, like, that journey of just, like, that snippet of, like, oh, you're thinking about starting a new routine, you know, what is that, like, entire journey, like, step by step, like, of, "Oh, I thought about it," and then all of the associated feelings and phases that come with it. And again, what to me feels nice about this is, like, depending on the scope of your research, you might not be able to, like, dig into every single question, right? So then if as a team, we can't even understand this initial journey, we probably shouldn't be talking about all those other like solutions and things that come out of like the types of support that people need, right? So for me, it's like a really good indicator of like, okay, like we don't maybe know the journey yet. So the first step for this research should really be to dig into that problem space rather than trying to ask them this question really quickly, move on from it, and then, go and ask about solution types. So one more example, what would you tell a friend who wants to start a new routine even if you didn't follow that advice yourself? So we have start small and build slowly, track your progress every day, give yourself permission to fail. I'd interpret this as the synthetic data showing that our audience knows the right advice, but they don't always apply them to themselves. And this tracks with that first question of I have a goal that I want to achieve, and but there's that like self-doubt that comes in. So I think that is a very human thing of like, I would tell my friends these amazing things, but I wouldn't necessarily apply that to myself. Right. So that could be very interesting and kind of understanding like people might say these things outwardly of like, well, I would tell myself to start slowly, or, I would, tell myself not to overthink too much. But they might not be doing that for themselves. So that's a good way to kind of understand, okay, you know, this is something kind of to dig into beyond the surface, because people might be saying these things just because they're saying them, right? Which tends to happen because we want to be seen in a good light from that standpoint. So I would say like this is like a really interesting question to then follow up with, again with that human-based research of maybe you could do the scenario like, what's a piece of advice that you gave a friend that you have never followed yourself, right? Again, and like that just gives like a really interesting conversation point within the interview. And I think that's I mean that's part of the beauty of this is like testing out some of these questions and seeing like, okay, like these could be really great interview questions for us to then dig into. And reverse engineering reasoning is not very easy. So I give some tips here if you're struggling with this. So this is just one way to look across synthetic data. It's just the way that I have tried and experimented with. This is all to say that again, like this is a lot of experimentation, right? Like it's not something that we just like see and can do and just can understand and we don't need to worry about it ever again. Just like with anything else, like I remember doing jobs to be done studies, and it was just pretty horrendous because I had no idea how to do jobs to be done. So it's another thing to learn. So again, like this is a great way to experiment with the data in a low stakes way. So I just go through and talk through how to apply this to your study just as a follow-up. And I would say like that the most important two steps are to write up your hypothesis and then reality check with human follow-up, right? So we never want to stop with synthetic. We want to then take it through to that human evaluation, because again, this is a prediction based on a whole lot of data, and we want to continue to evaluate for nuances, lived experience, past experience, things that synthetic does not perform at this given moment. So, and remember to refer back to the guide about that, and about when to use it and when to kind of shy away from it. But overall, I was pleasantly surprised. I've done studies on routines and food before, which is the two studies that I ran through synthetic. And I would say that a lot of the results tracked with what I had known about and learned about within those human-based studies. However, what they did do is give me like food for thought on segmentation, on different mental models, and making sure that my questions are sound or as sound as possible. It also helped me with just like narrowing the scope of research. So from my standpoint, I think that this is a tool that we can use very thoughtfully and very intentionally, not with the mindset of, again, replacing research. That is not at all the point of this. It's again, it's like a tool in our toolkit that we can utilize. And I would say like the best thing you could do now is experiment with this. Like see how you can like run a study, run a study that you've run before, run a survey that you've run before, and see how it responds as compared to the human-based study, right? Or run these two things in parallel, or run a synthetic study and then run the human study and see how they perform. But what I would say is like using this as like brainstorming, as fielding questions, right? As narrowing scope is quite a nice way for us to again like become as efficient and effective as possible, because like this isn't going away. Like AI, synthetic, it's not going away. It will just kind of continue to build. And it's like, how do we then transition to using this in the most responsible, most ethical, most thoughtful, intentional, and effective way possible? So I hope that this guide was really, really helpful for you, both the video and the companion guide for this. So please let me know if you have any questions on this. Just pop them below. And yeah, I really do encourage you to go ahead and experiment and see how this feels for you. You might find many, many different ways to look at the data, of which I would be super excited to hear about. But I think the best thing and the most important thing is this is a tool. It's not a replacement, and we just need to use it heavily with intention. And when we use it, we can also educate others on how to use it best. So we become the forefront of how this is used. We become the forefront of, how we can use synthetic responsibly, ethically, and intentionally alongside research. So, anyways, yes, I hope that was helpful. Can't stress that enough, but here we are. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you soon.